Somebody at a party is explaining the Dunning-Kruger effect to you. You know the one. There's a graph. It shoots up fast to a peak on the left, and the peak has a name, Mount Stupid. And then it falls off a cliff into something called the Valley of Despair. And after that, it crawls back up toward a long, flat plateau where the actual experts live. They tap the peak with a finger. That's where the loud ones are, they say. That's the guy from accounting who spent the whole meeting explaining your job to you. Here's the problem. That graph is not in the study. It has never been in the study. David Dunning didn't draw it. Dunning-Kruger didn't draw it. It doesn't appear in the 1999 paper, and it doesn't appear in any of the follow-up work either of them published. Somebody made it on the internet, it got attached backwards to a real piece of research, and it has been living in corporate training slides ever since, shown to rooms full of people with expensive degrees who nod at it. Sit with that for a second, because it's genuinely funny. The most widely shared illustration of overconfidence in the world is something the public confidently invented. But that's the easy part, and I don't want to sell you the easy part. That's just the internet doing what the internet does. The harder thing comes later, and I'll tell you now so you know where this is going. There is a group of researchers who argue that the effect itself, the real finding in the real paper, is largely a trick of arithmetic. Not fraud, not a lie, just a shape that shows up in the data, whether or not the thing it's supposed to describe exists at all. By the end of this, you're going to have to make up your own mind about that, because the people who study it for a living haven't finished arguing. One quick thing before we start. I'm Vadim. I'm not a psychologist. I read the research and try to explain it properly. Nothing in this video is medical or psychological advice, and nothing in it is a diagnosis of you or anybody else. Every study I mention is linked in the description, and I'd rather you went and checked me than took my word for it. 4 things in order. What the 1999 study actually did, which almost nobody who quotes it has read, where the fake graph came from, and why it beat the real one so badly. Then the statistical objection, which is the part that actually matters. And finally, what survives all of it, because something does survive, and it's a lot less flattering than the version you already know. That last one is the reason I wanted to make this. It stops being a video about other people and starts being a video about you. And I'd guess you won't enjoy that section as much as the first 3. Dunning-Kruger and David Dunning published the paper in 1999 in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. The title is a mouthful, and it tells you almost everything. Unskilled and unaware of it, how difficulties in recognizing one's own incompetence lead to inflated self-assessments. 4 studies. Cornell undergraduates, which is worth holding on to because a lot of what got built on top of this rests on a few hundred students at one very selective American university in the late 90s. The tasks were ordinary. In one, students rated how funny a set of jokes were, and their ratings were compared against a panel of professional comedians. In another, logical reasoning problems, the kind you'd find on a law school entrance exam. In a third, grammar, standard written English, the sort of thing you either know or you don't. The humor one is worth pausing on because of how it was graded. The correct answer to, "Is this joke funny?" was defined as whatever the comedian said it was. That's a reasonable thing to do if you need a number. It is also a very soft floor to build a famous psychological law on top of, and I want you to keep it in your pocket because it matters later, when we get to how much weight this paper can actually carry. Then, after each test, they asked every participant the same question. How do you think you did compared to everyone else in this room? And here is the number that made the paper famous. The students in the bottom quarter, the ones who genuinely did worst, scored around the 12th percentile. Their guess about themselves put them around the 62nd. So they were near the bottom, and they thought they were comfortably above the middle. That gap is the effect. That's the whole thing. Now let me give you the part that almost never travels with it, because it changes the shape of the finding. The top performers were also wrong. In the other direction. The students who did best underestimated themselves. They assumed the tasks had been easy for everybody, so they assumed they were somewhere around average when they were far above it. And once you know that, look at what the actual data does. It is not a peak and a crash. Every group, top to bottom, guessed they were above average. The confident line runs almost flat, while the ability line climbs underneath it. Nobody starts at a summit and tumbles into a valley. In the real numbers, confidence goes up as skill goes up. It just doesn't go up fast enough to keep pace. Kruger and Dunning's explanation for this was elegant, and it's the reason the paper stuck. They argued the skills you need to do something well and the skills you need to judge whether you did it well are largely the same skills. If your grammar is bad, the exact knowledge you'd need to notice that your grammar is bad is the knowledge you don't have. They called it a double burden. You're wrong, and the same deficit that made you wrong hides the wrongness from you. That's a good idea. I want to be clear that I think it's a good idea, because I'm about to spend a long time attacking the evidence for it, and those are two different things. So, where did Mount Stupid come from? Nobody can point to a single moment, which is itself telling. What we can say for certain is where it isn't. It isn't in the 1999 paper. It isn't in Dunning's later work. There is no peak, no valley, no plateau, no journey. Those are not findings, they're a drawing. What seems to have happened is that somebody, somewhere in the mid-2000s, made a conceptual diagram to illustrate the idea. Not data, an illustration, the way you might sketch a curve on a napkin to make a point. And then it got shared, and the caption got shorter each time, and at some stage the words, "based on Kruger and Dunning," appeared underneath it, and after that it was over. It moved into management consulting decks. It moved into training seminars. It became the thing people show you to explain the thing. Ask yourself why that version won so completely. Because it's not an accident. The fake curve has a story in it. There's a beginning, a humiliation, and a redemption. You start out an idiot who doesn't know he's an idiot. You get slapped down. You crawl through the valley, and you come out the other side as someone worth listening to. That's not a graph. That's a narrative arc, and it's a flattering one, because everyone who looks at it places themselves past the valley. Nobody has ever pointed at Mount Stupid and said, "That's me, right now, today." The real finding has none of that. The real finding is a boring pair of lines where everyone is a bit too pleased with themselves, and the worst performers are simply the most wrong. No journey, no villain you can point at. Nothing you can put on slide 14. And this is the first place where I want to give you my actual opinion, rather than a summary. I don't think the fake graph spread because people are stupid. I think it spread because it does a job the real research refuses to do. It gives you a diagram that puts other people at the bottom and you somewhere near the top. That's a service. People pay for that service. The original paper doesn't offer it, so the original paper lost. Everything up to here is just the popular version being wrong about a real study. That's an easy story to tell, and it lets us all feel clever. Now, the harder one. Because a serious argument exists that the study itself doesn't show what it says it shows, and it has been running in the journals for over 20 years. The first shot came fast. In 2002, Joachim Kruger and Ross Mueller published a paper in the same journal with a title that gets straight to it. Unskilled, unaware, or both. Different Kruger, by the way, spelled with an extra E, which has confused people for 2 decades. Their argument had 2 pieces, and you don't need any statistics background to follow either. Piece 1 is called the better-than-average effect, and it's one of the most reliable findings in social psychology. People, on average, rate themselves as above average. Ola Svensson demonstrated this in 1981 with car drivers, and the number is still quoted because it's absurd. In his American sample, something like 93% of drivers placed themselves in the top half for driving skill. That is not possible. Half of them are wrong by definition. So before you run any test at all, you already know that almost everyone in your room is going to guess high. The people at the bottom aren't doing something special, they're doing what everyone does, and they just have further to fall. Piece 2 is regression to the mean, and it's the one that does the real damage. Any measurement you take is partly the thing you're measuring and partly noise, luck, a guess that happened to land, a question you'd seen before. Which means the people who scored lowest on a test are, on average, a mix of people who are genuinely weak and people who had a bad day. And the people who scored highest are a mix of the genuinely strong and the lucky. Now ask both groups to estimate themselves. Their self-estimates are also noisy, but the noise is different noise, uncorrelated with the noise in the test. So the estimates drift back toward the middle. The bottom group looks overconfident. The top group looks underconfident. And you get the exact pattern the paper reported. Let me make that concrete, because regression to the mean sounds like jargon, and it is actually very simple. Picture 100 people taking a test that's half knowledge and half luck. 25 true or false questions on something nobody studied for. The 25 people who land in the bottom quarter are not the 25 least knowledgeable people in the room. They're the weakest ones, plus a handful who happen to guess wrong 6 times in a row. And the top quarter is the strongest ones, plus a handful who guessed well. Now ask everybody to estimate their own rank. Their estimate cannot see the luck. Nobody knows which of their own guesses happened to land. So the estimates drift toward the middle, because the middle is where most people assume they are. Look at what falls out of that. The unlucky people in the bottom group estimated themselves well above their score. The lucky people in the top group estimated themselves below theirs. Draw it on a chart, and the bottom quarter looks wildly overconfident, and the top quarter looks charmingly modest. And I built that whole pattern out of coin flips. There was no psychology in it anywhere. That's the uncomfortable version. You can generate the Dunning-Kruger shape with numbers that contain no Dunning-Kruger effect whatsoever. Random data, run through the same analysis, produces the same picture. Then it got worse for the original claim. In 2006, Catherine Burson, Richard Larrick, and Joshua Clayman published work showing the effect flips depending on how hard the task is. Make the task easy, and you get the classic pattern. Make it genuinely difficult, and it reverses. Now the high performers are the ones who badly underestimate themselves. If a finding turns upside down when you change the difficulty of the quiz, then what you were measuring was partly the quiz. Edward Nuffer and colleagues went further in a pair of papers in 2016 and 2017 in the journal Numeracy. They argued that when you measure self-assessment in a way that doesn't build the flaw into the method, the effect largely stops appearing. Most people, in their data, were reasonably well calibrated about their own ability. Not perfectly, reasonably. And in 2020, Gilles Gignac and Marcin Zajankowski published a paper in the journal Intelligence with a title that leaves very little room for interpretation. The Dunning-Kruger effect is, mostly, a statistical artifact. The core of the technical complaint is worth understanding because once you see it, you can't unsee it. On the classic chart, one axis is your test score. The other axis is your self-estimate compared against your test score. Your test score is sitting on both axes. When a number appears on both sides of a comparison, the comparison is partly comparing the number to itself, and it will produce a relationship whether or not one exists in the world. That's not a subtle statistical quibble. That's the plot being built out of the same material twice. Now I have to slow down, because it would be very easy to end the video here and let you walk away saying Dunning-Kruger is debunked. It isn't, and I'd be doing the same thing I just spent 10 minutes complaining about. Dunning and the people who work in this area have pushed back, and their argument is not stupid. The pattern shows up across different countries and different cultures. And, more to the point, the statistical critiques mostly attack the graph and the method of analysis. They don't do much to the underlying claim, which was never really about a curve. The claim was that people are often unable to recognize their own errors in specific ways, and there is separate evidence for that, which doesn't depend on the disputed chart at all. So, here's my honest read of where the evidence actually stands, and I want to be clear this is a judgment call, not a settled fact. The better-than-average effect is solid. People do overrate themselves, reliably, across a lot of domains. That much survives everything. And here's the joke thing coming back, like I said it would. 4 studies, a few hundred students at one elite American university, and in one of them, the definition of a right answer was a panel of comedians agreeing with each other. That's a perfectly respectable piece of research. It is not a foundation you'd want to put a universal law of human nature on. Most of what happened to this paper happened after it left the journal, and none of that was Kruger and Dunning's doing. The double burden idea, that being bad at something can hide your badness from you, is plausible and has support in particular narrow settings. It has not been established as the general law of human self-knowledge that popular coverage treats it as. And the famous asymmetry? The claim that incompetent people are uniquely and dramatically deluded in a way that competent people aren't is on much thinner ice than you'd guess from how confidently it gets cited. A large chunk of it may be regression to the mean wearing a costume. The curve is fiction. That part is not in dispute. I want to tell you what I actually think, and you can throw it out if you disagree. I don't think Dunning-Kruger became famous because the evidence was strong. I think it became famous because it handed people a scientific-sounding way to call someone else an idiot. That's the function it performs. Watch for it. Every single time you see it deployed, it's pointed outward. At a coworker, at a politician, at a stranger in a comment section. In 20-something years of this phrase being in circulation, I have almost never seen anyone say, with a straight face, "I think I might be doing this right now." That's the tell. A finding that only ever gets applied to other people has stopped being used as science. It's an insult with a citation attached. And the irony is doing real work here, not just decoration. A paper about people confidently misjudging their own understanding became world famous through people confidently misjudging their understanding of it, illustrated by a chart that the confident misjudgers drew themselves. That's not a joke I'm making. That's the actual history of the thing. But here's the part I keep coming back to, and it's the reason this stayed interesting to me after the debunking stopped being fun. Go back to the 1999 data. Not the popular version, the real one. In that data, every single group thought it was above average. The bottom quarter, the middle, the top. All of them. The bottom quarter were just wrong by a wider margin. That's a much worse finding than the one on the poster. And it's worse specifically because it doesn't let you off. Mount Stupid is comfortable. It has a place for the idiots and a place for you, and they're not the same place. The real result doesn't have that. In the real result, the interesting question was never who's on the mountain. It's that everybody in the room, including the people who did well, walked in holding a slightly generous picture of themselves and walked out still holding it. Whether that picture is a robust psychological law or a statistical shadow, 25 years of arguing has not settled. Which is, if you think about it, the most honest possible ending for a study about the limits of knowing what you know. So, tell me in the comments where you first saw the curve. Slide deck at work, a video, a textbook, a tweet. I'm curious how it reached people, because, as far as I can tell, nobody knows who drew the thing, and somebody watching this might. All studies linked below. If I've got something wrong in here, say so and I'll correct it in the next one.